Hi, Steve Stedman here. Just trying to share some information as I see it. I've seen a lot of people online recently around Sandy Point asking questions about what's the best weather site, what's the best tide site, all of that. And I just wanted to share some of the things that I look at. They may not all be the best. The things that I look at when we're looking at what's going on with the weather and the tides and what's going to happen with king tides and things like that around Sandy Point. First off, there's this news release that came out from the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office, Department of Emergency Management, that was issued a day or two ago, warning and talking about king tides. And the specific dates and times it's talking about here were today, Saturday at 6:21 a.m., which we'll take a look at what actually happened on that one. Tomorrow at 6:57 a.m., and then Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, each day being about a half hour later than the previous day on the tides. The tides are forecasted to be up in about the 10.5 to 10.7 foot range there. Now, what happens in reality is that the tide predictions are based off of a standard atmospheric pressure of about 30 inches. They don't account for things like storm surge, which causes the height to be a little bit higher. But let's take a look. Flip back there for a second. So today it was forecast to be about a 10.52 foot tide at 6:21 a.m. this morning. And let's take a look at what actually happened. And this is this is a tide chart from NOAA, and they have a tide station somewhere off of Cherry Point that measures what actually happened. So the blue is what is the forecast. The red is what is a preliminary measurement that came from the NOAA tide station. And then if it was later, like somehow they go through and verify that it is indeed true, they verify that, and the red line turns green at that point. If we look here, we can look at about 6 a.m., kind of right around there, 6:15. Let's look back. What was that? 6:21 was where the forecast was. So we look about 6:24, and the prediction was a 10.51 foot tide. But in reality, it came in as a 9.92 foot tide. Okay, so how did that happen? Our weather, we had pretty good high pressure at that point compared to what we've seen in previous storms or storm data. As we look here, we can see that anytime the actual or the preliminary data that's been recorded, the red line is below the blue line, that's telling me that we're getting lower tides than what was forecast. Now, knowing what happened with flooding and things like that at Sandy Point, lower tides than forecast are never the issue. It's always the higher tides than what's being forecast. So as we see here, starting around, roughly around noon today, maybe 11:30, maybe 11 or so, that red line starts to cross the blue line. And then we start seeing 1 p.m., for instance, at local time here, that we're about 0.2 of a foot higher than the actual preliminary. Now, if we look at this same chart and we go back in time to, let's say, we can go back and look at December 27th, where the last flooding occurred. And same date down here, December 27th. When we look at that day with the big flooding, you can see the green line is what's been verified, but we can look at the blue line as being the forecast. When that flooding was occurring, the actual tide was about a 12.51 foot tide instead of a 10.67 or what. So it's roughly about 2 feet higher than what the forecast was there when we look at the day with all the flooding. Okay, so one of the things I also want to look at regarding today. Okay, so here's today's chart. Well, this is yesterday and today, so let me just change it to today. Okay, when we look at today's chart, earlier in the day we were below the forecast. Now we're starting to go above the forecast. Well, why did that happen, and what happened around 11 a.m. that caused the tide levels to start recording higher than the forecast rather than lower than that? Well, what I'm going to take a look at is my personal weather station here that I have on the top of my house. And we're going to scroll down and look at the data. And what's really interesting here is if we look at the charts here for today, right here around 10:30 to 11 a.m., what we saw was an increase in wind and wind gusts, where wind is currently in the 30 to 37 or 32, kind of that range, mile an hour, coming in from like zero to very little wind, and it shifted at that point. The other thing we saw is the wind direction shifted. Instead of coming out of the northeast, it shifted to come out at the south-southeast. And at the same time, because that wind pattern is coming from a different direction, our temperature went up dramatically, which I don't know how much the temperature affects things. But what we're seeing as we go through this is the barometer, and that's this black line down here at the bottom. The barometer is continuing to drop. And the forecast was that the barometer would drop today, and then it would start increasing later in the day. If we scroll up and take a look at the forecast, we can see, and I'm looking at the 10-day forecast here. And again, I want to point out one thing. I'm not forecasting anything. I'm not qualified to do any of that. I'm just showing you what's showing up on the Weather Underground website. And you can see here, this forecast shows the barometers dropping, and it's forecast to drop to about 30.09 inches, or we'll call it 30 even, and then it's supposed to start coming back up. But when we go back to where it's at the current point in time, back one more page here, the barometer is actually at 29.82, so significantly lower than what the forecast was for that point in time. And that's one of those things, I mean, you see the weather guessers on TV or weather forecasters, whatever you want to call them. There's a lot of guess. There's a lot of educated guess and a lot of training that goes into that, but in reality, the actual storm that hits at any specific location can vary greatly. And here, we're seeing that our current pressure is 29.82, which is quite a bit lower than the forecast. I want to share another piece of data here as we're talking about the barometric pressure. So keep in mind our current pressure is about 29.81, and it is dropping, but it's nowhere near the level of barometric pressure we had when we've had previous flooding. What this chart is this is showing the barometric pressure over the last 2.5 years as measured at Sandy Point. And our December 27th flooding was the absolute lowest barometric pressure on record for the last 2.5 years. Looking at a wider set of data, there's a number of local weather stations that have reported it's the lowest we've had in 25 years, but I don't have the evidence to back that up with my data. Here, what we see, though, is it's the lowest in the last 2.5 years, and it's at 28.7 as our barometric pressure. Our January 7th flooding of 2022, that was here, and that's at right around 29 roughly, maybe just a hair under 29. Actually, yeah, when I looked at the actual number, it's a hair under 29, like 29.9. And then on October of 2021, there was a little bit of flooding that caused a bunch of logs and things to jam up the entry to the canal and came up on top of the jetty out at the end there. So with those three lowest barometric pressure points, those are indicators of when we've had some of the worst flooding. Now, I don't want to make you think that it's just related to barometric pressure, because that can change quite a bit. I mean, there's a lot of other factors that go into it. Right here, I'm just seeing that when the barometer gets that low, that's when we start to have issues. Now, where we're at right now, let's just check for an update as to where we're at. The barometric pressure is currently 29.82 inches. And if we look at this chart and we draw a line across at 29.82, that's right about here. And we can see that historically, we're maybe about average or slightly higher than average pressure right now. So as far as the pressure goes, currently we're doing okay, but we'll just have to monitor and see where it goes from there. One of the things here that this morning, yes, we were lower, and looking out at the time that this high tide was high, it was, to me, it seemed significantly lower than we've seen when we've had any kind of flooding events. So today, not at all worried here. One thing I do want to point out, people ask, well, what's the pattern here on the tides? And typically every day, it's slightly longer than a 24-hour cycle, but in that, we'll call it 24.5-hour cycle, we usually have 2 high tides and 2 low tides. And here, the high tide is this one at, and we scroll down, no, we don't have it actually there, but on a different chart, we can see that there's the 2 highs, and then we have a low that's here that was around 11:30, and then we have a low in the middle of the night. So not every low is as low and not every high is as high. Typically, you have a pattern like this, the dip between the two highs might be a little bit lower than what we're seeing here, but in general, in about every 24.5-hour cycle, we've got two highs and two lows, and because that cycle's a fraction longer than a day, what that means is every day our tides shift a little bit. When we go back to the chart, the warning here, when we see 621, 657, 731, it's shifting by about a half hour each day. And that's because the tide cycles are such that they never line up on the exact time day to day, and the whole cycle is slightly longer than a day. Keep in mind, these are also the highest tides of the day, not that second high tide that we have that's slightly lower than the highest high. Another thing I wanted to share, there's this website I built a long time ago called sandypoint.us. It's just a place that I've grouped some links and photos and weather-related stuff. If you go to the site and click on tides and you scroll down, I have some links down here to a number of different tide charts. So this first one that says NOAA charts for Sandy Point that are greater than 10 foot shown in red, that's what I'm looking at when I'm thinking of flooding, disasters, water in the yard, things like that. The next ones that are ranging from, and it's all the same charts, it's just that they're highlighted a little bit differently. These are things I use when I'm navigating in and out of the channel. And then this bottom one down here that's tidesandcurrents.noaa.gov, that's the one that actually shows us the actual recorded data that we're seeing over here. And when we look at the difference, if we look at here's the ones with greater than 10 foot tide, this is going to give us a 2-day forecast showing here is where we're currently at. We're approaching another high, but tomorrow's where our next bigger high is going to be at 10.2 foot. And if we shift ahead one day, then we're going to 10.21, slightly higher, and then 10.19. So usually when we see these kind of king tides, the way it comes in is it's sort of each day it gets a little bit higher, a little bit higher, a little bit higher until it hits the peak, and then each day is a little bit lower and a little bit lower until we get back to our kind of average tides. All right, so just sharing some information here. I hope everybody enjoyed this. I'm Steve Stedman, and just want to share the details as I'm seeing it. By no means does this include any forecasting information on my part, any guessing about what's going to happen in the future, or any recommendation about what people should do to take care of themselves. Just sharing the details, the data that I use. The three things I'm really using here are the Wonderground website, or Weather Underground if you go to the long URL for it, and then a couple of different NOAA tide prediction sites. All right, have a great day.